I want to say this carefully because in 2026, you basically need a lawyer, a doctor, a fact checker, a priest, all standing behind you before you're allowed to ask any obvious questions about anything we see or hear or read. But something about this Hantavirus cruise ship story feels off. Not necessarily fake, not necessarily engineered, not some grand villain lair conspiracy theory where a guy with a shaved cat is pressing a red button under a mountain somewhere. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the coverage has been weird. All right, now walk with me here for a moment. The information flow seems weird, doesn't it? The timeline seems weird. The public messaging is weird. And after all we lived through in 2020, weird does not get the benefit of the doubt anymore. Now, the ship, of course, is the MV Hondius. According to WHO, the WHO, that is, the outbreak-linked voyage departed from Ushuaia, Argentina. I'm sorry if I screwed up that city name, but departed from Argentina on April 1st. ECDC says the same. Reuters, meanwhile, reports that some passengers and crew had been on board since March 20th. Now, that might be explainable. Maybe there were back-to-back expedition legs. Maybe some crew and passengers boarded earlier. Maybe the official outbreak itinerary starts on April 1st, while the ship's practical passenger timeline starts earlier. That could be fine. But then you need to say that clearly, because after the last several years, when health officials give timelines that require a decoder ring, people notice. So here's the official timeline as best we can piece it together. April 6th, a passenger starts showing symptoms, fever, headache, mild diarrhea. April 11th, that passenger develops respiratory distress and dies on board. The WHO says no microbiological tests were performed. On April 21st, his body then is removed at St. Helena, and his wife, a close contact, also gets off the ship with gastrointestinal symptoms. She deteriorates then during a flight to Johannesburg and dies on April 26th. Then on May 2nd, another passenger dies on board. By May 4th, the WHO is reporting 7 cases, including 3 deaths, and now we're seeing 27 or something by last count. I'm sure there'll be more by the time you watch this clip. Now, this isn't nothing, all right? 3 people have died, a small expedition ship, remote islands, a virus most people had barely thought about since the occasional news story, about rodents in cabins, or more recently, the death of Gene Hackman's wife being discussed in connection with Hantavirus. And yet the media behavior around all this has been strangely narrow. Now let's take the ship log and passenger log discrepancies and set those aside. Where are the human stories from the media? All right, if you remember COVID and the pandemic, there was a ticker as to the deaths every day. We were seeing B-roll loops of hospitals and closed down businesses and all kinds of things. Right now, yes, it's more contained. We have 3 people dead, including a Dutch couple. But I wonder, why haven't major outlets been knocking down doors to interview family and friends or neighbors or fellow passengers, anyone who knew them? I'm not saying harass grieving families, but I am saying this is what media does, right? They do it after shootings. They do it after plane crashes. In fact, they do it after a celebrity's cousin's dog gets a mysterious rash, right? But suddenly, with a deadly international cruise ship virus story, the human angle is strangely thin. And then there's the social media question, right? People these days, we're documenting our sandwich orders. We've been doing that, for now several years. We film airline delays. We film fights in hotel lobbies. We film our experience getting bad coffee, cruise buffets, arguments over reclining seats in airplanes, and raccoons in dumpsters like they're Ken Burns documentaries, right? So when a cruise ship allegedly dealing with a deadly outbreak, why did the world seem to only get a few passenger dispatches at first, particularly really just one dude sitting in his room crying, who has some connections by some reports to being like a travel ambassador? It's just weird. I do want to be fair. People magazine reported that there's a passenger, Kasim Hatuda or Hatada. I'm not sure how to say his name. Again, I'm sorry for my pronunciations. Kasim said there were no posting restrictions, that the passengers all had Wi-Fi, that most people simply wanted privacy because of sudden media attention. That could be true. People also reported that only a few passengers had publicly posted updates, including a couple of content creators. Now, again, that could be true. Privacy is real. Fear, of course, is real. And not everyone wants to become the face of a Hantavirus TikTok trend. But the question remains, on a ship with roughly 150 people, in a story touching multiple countries with 3 deaths, and a public desperate to know what's going on, why is the information stream so thin? Why are we getting just tiny drips instead of a flood? And then, of course, there's the medical messaging. The CDC says the Andes virus is the only known hantavirus known to spread person to person. And even then, spread is usually limited to very close contact with a sick person. That is direct physical contact, prolonged time in close or enclosed spaces, or exposure to bodily fluids. That's the CDC. The ECDC says person-to-person Andes virus transmission has only been documented following close and prolonged contact. This is what we have. So the WHO and others say the global risk is low and that human-to-human transmission is uncommon. In other words, this Andes strain of the hantavirus, it's really hard it's difficult for it to pass from person to person. But then why does so much of the coverage feel like we're being slow walked back into the old respiratory virus script from 5 and 6 years ago? Quarantining, international tracing, emergency response, watch for symptoms. If you develop shortness of breath, seek care. Some of that, of course, is going to be medically appropriate depending on what the situation is. Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, of course, is serious. And the CDC says early symptoms can look like the flu, but later symptoms do include difficulty breathing. Mayo Clinic says to get immediate medical care if you have trouble breathing. Okay, fine. That looks great on paper. But I think we can understand why. When people hear these things and we start to think, well, here we go again. Because we remember 2020. We remember 2 weeks to slow the spread. We remember just wear this until. We remember experts saying one thing on Monday, then the opposite on Friday, then calling you a domestic terrorist on Sunday for remembering what they said on Monday, and of course, canceling all your social media accounts when you dare to post that on Tuesday. And then we get Moderna. Bloomberg reported that Moderna had said it had already been researching hantavirus vaccines before this cruise outbreak. Other reporting and research indicate that the hantavirus vaccine work did not start yesterday. There has been prior Andes virus vaccine research, including mRNA work in animal models that was published in 2024. Now, no, the fact that a company was researching a vaccine before an outbreak doesn't prove that the outbreak was planned. Of course not. Pharmaceutical companies research potential threats. That is what they do. But politically, culturally, trust-wise, you have to be willfully blind not to understand why the public sees deadly virus and then expert warnings and then quarantine and then Moderna already working on a vaccine and says, oh, I've seen this episode before and I hate the ending. And this is the real problem. The medical and political establishment spent years lighting public trust on fire, and now they act shocked when we smell smoke every time they walk into the room. They told us things that were flat out untrue and came out and admitted it later on. They suppressed debate. They censored speech. They smeared doctors. They censored ordinary citizens. They changed definitions. They treated natural rights like temporary privileges. They used fear as public policy. And then they sat back and watched people lose jobs, businesses, churches, schools, friendships, years of life, and then just shrugged, oops, the science is evolving. I don't recall. Nobody meaningful paid a price out of that. Nobody went to prison. That's one of the frustrations with the Trump administration, is that the people who were in charge of that nonsense, none of them were held accountable. Nobody lost a pension. Nobody stood at a podium and said, we lied, we manipulated, we abused power. We're sorry. No. Instead, the same class of people put on the same serious faces, and expect the rest of us to line up again like it's 2020 and we're all too exhausted to ask questions. No, we're not doing this again. We're not doing 2020 again. We're not going back to a government by panic. We're not going back to experts who demand trust while refusing accountability. We are not going back to media outlets that treat skepticism as a disease worse than the disease. And at the same time, and this is the part adults have to say out loud, okay? Hantavirus can be real. The coverage can still be suspicious at the same time. A virus can be dangerous, and the public messaging can still be manipulative. A public health response can be necessary and still deserve hard questions. These are not contradictions. This is called being awake. So here are questions. Why did it take so long for the story to become clear when the first death happened April 11th and WHO was notified on May 2nd? Why were microbiological tests, for example, not done after the first onboard death? And this is, again, according to the WHO. Why did passengers disembark and scatter internationally before the public seemed to understand what this was? Why are we not hearing more from people who knew the deceased? Why are there so few passengers and passenger videos compared with what we would expect in a social media dominated age? Why do some outlets talk about this like it's a common respiratory contagion when official sources keep saying that Andes virus transmission requires close and prolonged contact? And why, after all we have lived through, are we supposed to pretend that it's irrational to ask these questions? The tragedy of 2020 is not only what happened then and in the years after, but the tragedy is what it did to the next emergency. Because if a truly catastrophic virus appears tomorrow, millions of Americans may not believe the people warning them. And that won't be because Americans are stupid. It will be because the institutions have trained Americans not to believe them. You cannot spend years poisoning the well and then complain that nobody wants a drink. So yeah, let's investigate the virus, see what's going on. Protect passengers, care for the sick, tell the truth about the dead, but we can be spared the lectures, all right? The public does not owe blind trust to institutions that never repented for breaking that trust in the first place. And if the experts want trust back, here's a wild idea. Start with the whole truth in plain English the first time. Because we are done being managed. We are done being nudged. We are done being treated like cattle with a Wi-Fi. And if that makes the professional panic class uncomfortable, well, good. Maybe discomfort is what accountability might feel like when it finally starts breathing down their necks for a change. Now, here in Culture Crossroads, if hantavirus becomes a thing, we're going to bring you not just the expert class, but we're going to bring you people on the front lines who are not afraid to tell the truth. We're going to follow the truth wherever it leads. Right now, the breakdown I just gave you, that's what we have. That's what we know as of this production. So if you want to get through the mess, the hype, the fear-mongering, all that stuff, be sure to like, subscribe to this channel, and also don't miss Culture Crossroads every Sunday evening at 5 p.m. Central on becktv.plus. We get censored in other parts of social media for talking about things like this. We don't get censored on the Beck News channel. So make sure if you don't see it here, check out the archives on becktv.plus. That is BEKTV.plus. As always, thank you for spending some time with us. Let us know what you think in the comments. What do you think is going on here? Is this something that we need to pay attention to a little bit more, or is this much ado about nothing? Hantavirus has been around. There actually have been other hantavirus outbreaks in the past. Is this one any different than anything we've seen before? Let us know. Again, try to keep it civil if you can. Let's all be at least somewhat friends, even though we're not really friends. I get it. But as always, thank you for watching.